maybe you've been told keep your ISO low to avoid noise, and so you religiously stick to using ISO 100. But, well, here's the twist. ISO doesn't matter as much as you probably think it does, at least not with today's cameras anyway. So I'm going to walk you through 7 reasons why high ISO isn't the villain that it's made out to be, and I'm going to show you how you can embrace higher ISO settings to capture brighter, cleaner images without stressing over noise. Are you ready? Well, let's dive right in. Okay, so let's clear up one of the biggest misconceptions right away. ISO does not make your camera sensor more sensitive to light. That's an old hangover from the film days, and in digital photography, it's simply not true. So what does ISO actually do then? Well, you can think of your camera sensor like being a bucket collecting rain or light. Now, no matter what you do with your ISO setting, the bucket size, well, the sensor's ability to capture light, remains the same. So when you increase ISO, you're not collecting more rain. Instead, you're turning up the power that amplifies the signal, the amount of rain that's already been captured. That is why ISO is often called a post-exposure adjustment. And here's the practical takeaway from all that technical mumbo jumbo. ISO is just a brightness amplifier. It doesn't increase the actual light that's being captured, but it does make your image appear brighter by digitally boosting the signal. Now, you might be wondering, if it's just an amplifier, why not keep ISO super low and then brighten it up in post-production in Lightroom later on? Well, great question. Stick with me because the answer to this question ties into something called the signal to noise ratio, which we're going to dive into next. Okay, so here's the part where ISO gets a bad rap. You've probably heard that cranking ISO introduces noise, those grainy speckled patterns that you see covering your photo that can ruin your perceived image quality. But here's the thing, right? ISO itself does not create noise. Are you surprised? Well, let's break it down. Think of it like this. Imagine recording someone whispering from the far end of a noisy room. When you amplify the recording to hear the whisper clearly, you also amplify all of that background noise that was happening at the same time. And that's exactly how ISO works. It doesn't create the noise, but it amplifies the unwanted noise that's already present when your camera sensor registers the light that was hitting it. In practice, what this means is that the noise in your photos is coming from the low light situation that you're trying to capture, not the high ISO amplification. If your scene doesn't have enough light to begin with, then your camera is going to struggle to separate the signal, which is the light, from the noise, which is all of the background interferences. And increasing ISO amplifies both, making the noise more visible. But here is the kicker, right? Modern cameras are insanely good at managing noise. And even at high ISO settings, you can capture clean images that would have otherwise been completely impossible just a decade or so ago. And you might be feeling a little bit skeptical at that point, but wait until we talk about ISO invariants in a second, because that could very well blow your mind. Now, you're on this channel, you're taking photos. How would you like to turn your images from meh images that no one really cares about to, that's pretty interesting, that's a decent photo? Well, if you want to take a leap in your photography, why not download our completely free cheat sheets? They're packed with tons of practical tips, no matter whether you're shooting portraits, landscapes, or something in between. If you want to grab them, click the link in the description below this video and grab a copy of the cheat sheet today. Okay, so let's talk about something that many photographers don't even realize exists, this idea of ISO invariance. Now, ISO invariance, it's kind of a fancy term, but the concept is pretty simple. Some cameras are designed so that whether you brighten an image by increasing the ISO in camera or you boost the exposure later on in your post-processing software, the results are nearly identical. This phenomenon exists because there are 2 types of noise. You've got photon noise, and this is the noise produced by, unsurprisingly, photons. This is the light in the scene that you're capturing hitting your sensor. This, well, is what it is, and it's nothing to do with your camera. Read noise, however, is the noise produced by your camera's own electronics. And an ISO invariant camera, like my Sony a7R4s, well, they have essentially near zero read noise. So whether you increase the exposure on the computer or in camera, there is near zero read noise to be increased, and so the results are going to be very similar between the two setups. However, I've got to point out, right, that not all cameras are equally ISO invariant. Older models tend to perform worse when you underexpose the image in camera and then brighten later, whilst newer ones are much, much better at it. So if you're rocking a modern DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you've probably got way more flexibility than you might realize. And here's a quick experiment that you can try. Take a control shot at ISO 6400 in manual mode, so all the settings are locked in. Use a tripod and make sure that each subsequent shot is going to be somewhat lined up. Then take another shot at ISO 100 without changing any other settings. This shot obviously now is going to be massively underexposed. Finally, take both images, throw them into Lightroom and match the exposures between the two images. And if your camera is ISO invariant, well, like magic, the amount of noise in both images is going to be almost identical. And speaking of magic, let's move on to why base ISO still matters and how it can help you nail those dreamy, noise-free shots. If ISO doesn't matter as much as we think, why do camera manuals make such a big deal about base ISO? Well, base ISO isn't a total myth. It's a setting where your camera produces its cleanest, highest quality images. And for most cameras, this is going to be ISO 100, although some Nikon cameras can even go lower, like ISO 64. And base ISO is where your sensor works at its peak efficiency, delivering maximum dynamic range, so the ability to capture details in both the shadows and the highlights, and also where your camera sensor is going to have minimum noise. You can think of it as your camera's resting heart rate. It's calm, it's steady, but it's ready for action. But here's the catch. Yeah, sure, it might be the most efficient state for your camera to take images, but you don't have to stick to your base ISO religiously. If you need to crank up ISO to freeze motion or brighten a dark scene, then do it. The slight loss in dynamic range or a slight increase in noises is often a small price to pay for getting that shot nailed. I mean, imagine trying to capture a hummingbird mid-flight at sunset. Sticking to ISO 100 would force you to use a slower shutter speed, turning that graceful bird into just a big blurry mess. Bumping the ISO up to 1600, even 3200, whatever it takes essentially, is going to allow you to capture the action. And yes, of course, there might be a little bit more noise, but trust me, no one's going to care about a little bit of noise when the shot of the animal, the scene, the person, whatever it is so epic. And quite frankly, if you're still worried about noise at this point, you need to wait until you see what AI noise reduction tools can do. We're going to cover that in a minute, but first let's cover another common ISO myth. So you've probably seen those camera specs bragging about extended ISO ranges like ISO 50 on the low end, or a mind-boggling ISO 100,000 on the high end. And this sounds pretty impressive, right? But there's a dirty little secret. Extended ISO isn't typically as useful as it seems. Let's break it down here because, well, extended ISO aren't real ISO settings. Instead, they're achieved through, well, digital trickery from within inside your camera. Because when you shoot at an extended ISO, your camera takes the image at the native ISO setting. So let's say ISO 100. Then it artificially brightens or darkens it to mimic an ISO 50 or ISO 100,000 setting. It's essentially the same as underexposing or overexposing your shot later on by tweaking it in Lightroom. And what's the problem with that? Well, basically, extended ISO sacrifices quality, and you can do all of this better in Lightroom after the fact. Using extended ISO is going to give you more noise, less dynamic range, and again, you're better off just doing it after the fact if that's what you need to do to get the image looking how you want it. And speaking of image quality, let's take a look at something that is, well, incredibly important to the ISO conversation, and it just frankly didn't exist. It literally did not exist just a few years ago. Here is some good news. Even if your high ISO shots are, well, a little bit noisy, modern AI-powered tools can work absolute wonders in clearing them up. Gone are the days of spending hours manually trying to tweak sliders and using plugins and loads of faffing around in Photoshop. Tools like Topaz Denoise AI and even Lightroom's own AI noise reduction tool can remove noise whilst preserving incredible amounts of detail. You can think of these tools like noise cancelling headphones for your photos. They analyze the patterns of noise in your image and then separate it from the details that you want to keep. This gives you sharp edges and clear textures. The result, a cleaner, sharper image that still looks pretty natural. And the best part is that these tools are they're incredibly easy to use. There is no skill barrier to getting stuck in with all of these AI denoise tools. Open your noisy image, apply the preset, and let the AI do its magic. And in most cases, you're going to end up with a photo that looks like it was shot at a much lower ISO. So, does this mean that you should, well, crank up your ISO without a second thought? Well, not quite. Whilst AI noise reduction is powerful, it's not a free pass to ignore proper exposure settings. But it does mean that you should shoot with the confidence you've got a little bit of leeway either side here, that even noisy photos can still be salvaged. So let's take a look at why you should not be fearful of taking high ISO images. Yes, high ISO can amplify noise. But as we discussed, noise isn't inherently bad. And in many cases, honestly, it's barely noticeable. I'm running a photography competition over at photographyexplained.com/awards right now. There'll be a link in the description below this video as well if you want to check it out. And so there's tons and tons and tons of images coming in day after day as we kind of wrap up this competition now. And some of the best images that I've seen so far have noise in them. I don't care. I'm sure the judges, when they see the images, they won't care either. Let me put this into perspective. Imagine capturing a once-in-a-lifetime shot of a starry sky or a dramatic action scene. Would you rather have a slightly noisy but usable image, or a perfectly clean image that's too dark to see anything? Exactly right, it's obvious. Plus, and you can push back on this. You won't offend me if you push back, but I find that sometimes a little bit of noise often adds some character to the image. Film photographers embrace grain as part of their aesthetic, and the same principle can apply to a little, not loads, a little bit of digital noise too. A little bit of texture can make your photos feel a little bit more organic, real, and less clinical. And here's my challenge to you. Next time you're shooting in a low light situation, experiment with high ISO settings. Push your camera to its limits. You might be surprised at how much detail and clarity you can still achieve. And remember, your audience, no matter where you show your photos, whether it's on Instagram, it's with your friends, it's on the walls in your house, your audience is looking at the story that your photo tells. They're not pixel peeping for noise. Unless they're a photographer, they really don't care. So go out there, take the shot, get it done, no matter what ISO setting you've got to use. And if you'd like to continue improving your photography skill set, why not click the video that's on the screen right now.